Hey everybody, welcome to the PastorCast. We've got another great episode. We're going to continue talking about Christian worship today, and especially why is it so diverse from place to place, congregation to congregation. We're looking forward to it. Let's get started.
Skiddle-a-doo, I said bill bop. Skiddle-a-doo, I said bill. Skiddle-a-doo, I said skid out and bop. Skiddle-a-doo, I said bill bop boom. Skiddle-a-doo, I said bill bop. Skiddle-a-doo, I said bill. Skiddle-a-doo, I said skid out and bop. Skiddle-a-doo, I said bill bop boom.
Hey everybody, it's Bill and Scott with you for this edition of the PastorCast. Like Scott said, we've got a great main topic coming up. But first, you know what? This is Fall Festival Week. It's this Saturday. And we need your help to make this great community outreach a big success. A few things. First is this beauty right here, this candy cannon. Devin, who plays electric guitar for us, engineered this amazing thing we've had for several years now that rains down candy upon the children. Let's look at the joy on their faces. We need to stuff that with candy. So if you want to donate nice soft candies like Tootsie Rolls, Starburst, or Swedish Fish, individually wrapped, please, we would welcome those donations.
All right. And we also have a need for trunk or treat trunks. If you are willing to decorate your trunk and hand out candy, have so many examples of what people have done in the past. If you're a creative person, you'd like to do this, we need your help. That's a great way to volunteer. And we're just going to need people to volunteer in a whole number of different ways. And so if you haven't signed up, make sure you get in touch with the church. You can just let us know on Facebook. You can even reply to this video. We'll make sure that we get in contact with you. And we're going to need just a lot of people to welcome in the community. We're expecting a few thousand people, and we want to have our best foot forward as a church. And so we'd love it if you'd be willing to help.
All right, and thanks as well for helping us get the word out so that your friends, coworkers, family, neighbors, they're all coming to this great event this Saturday at 4 o'clock. All right, Scott, are you ready to tackle today's main topic?
All right, we've started this new series on worship. Let's get going. All right, the main topic today is worship, and we're particularly asking this question: why is it so diverse? I mean, you can go to campuses, you can go to prisons, you can go to hospitals, you can go to military bases. You'll find that worship is different. From congregation to congregation, church to church, you'll find that people worship differently from each other. Some are more formal, some are less formal. Small churches, big churches, you'll find differences. And then from culture to culture to culture, you'll go from Kenya to Cambodia to China to Australia. You'll find that worship is different in each one of those places. The question is, why? Why is it so diverse? And so we're going to get things started here. Bill, you're our worship pastor here, and I know that when it comes to analyzing worship, you like to analyze it according to 4 levels. Maybe you could talk us through that.
Yeah, this is helpful, I think. And like I said last week, a lot of these are not my original thoughts. I'm a seminary student at Calvin Theological Seminary. This was part of our class that we just had. Our professor said there are 4 ways that you can analyze worship. You see them on the screen here. The first and the highest level is this essence, this idea of what is the purpose of worship. And we talked about that last week, so I won't belabor the point here. Invite you to go back and watch week 1 if you missed it. But there is a purpose for why we as human beings worship and why we specifically gather in congregations to worship. Beyond that, number 2 is something a little bit more specific, and that is what is the form of worship. If we're analyzing a worship service, worship services have different forms. And in most congregations like ours, you'll see a form that's basically a dialogue. So you get to hear from God as we read the scripture. You'll get to respond to God through song, through prayer. And that's just one example of the form that worship can take. Now, getting even more specific, there's a third level of analysis, that is style. And style is what we often think about when we think about the diversity of worship. How you dress, how you talk, what kind of music you use, whether it's classical or vintage or 90s or very modern. These are all style issues. And then lastly, the most specific is mechanics, number 4. And that's very simple. It changes week to week. So what mic we choose to use on what instrument, what singer stands where, it's kind of the way the style gets fleshed out. And so if you have determined your style is like a come as you are kind of church that welcomes people in, then maybe the mechanics is it's okay to wear jeans. It's okay to have a certain instruments to accomplish your style mission. So anyway, Scott, those are 4 different ways that we think about how to analyze worship.
Let me make sure I understand. I think, if I'm hearing you right, what you're saying is that the diversity of worship isn't so much an issue of essence.
Right.
That, at its essence, we're doing totally different things. It's more down at the level of style or even mechanics where we find that great diversity. And I think that makes sense.
Yeah, that's what this next slide is about. We're asking the question today, why is Christianity diverse? Well, before we get there, we have to ask, how is it diverse? And it's diverse mainly in the style. All Christian congregations that gather for worship typically have a very similar purpose in gathering, to express their praise to God, to meet with Him, to be with other believers. A lot of churches have the same form or very similar form. But when you get down to style and mechanics, it starts differing. So we're going to spend our time today talking about why these things differ from congregation to congregation.
So why is the style of worship and the mechanics of worship different from place to place? What would be some of the main things that you would point to?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. I would put it like this. What guides the style difference? As churches, we choose one style over another. And it's not a random choice, but it's a choice we make intentionally. So what guides our selection of a particular style? Okay? Three verses I want to share with you. The first is John 1:14. We see Jesus as the example for how to do ministry. And one of the great things about Jesus is God did not reveal Himself to us by yelling from heaven in a language that we couldn't understand in this divine, But no, Jesus, it says, the Word became flesh and made His dwelling among us. We've seen His glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. So this is a verse about incarnation, literally incarnate, in the flesh. And that's our model for ministry as well, that we want to be incarnate in our communities, that when we serve here in South Florida, the residents of St. Lucie West, Port St. Lucie, Fort Pierce, the whole area, we want to be incarnate in that area, just like Jesus was coming and living among them. He became a man, He became a Jewish man, He became a person fully enculturated in that culture, and that's what we want to do too. The second scripture that I find important is Acts 15. This is the story of the Jerusalem Council, and I won't belabor the details, but basically the Jerusalem Council faced this question, hey, there's some Gentiles that are looking to become Christians. Do they have to become Jews first? And there's a lot of theological nuance in there, but at the end of the day, the point of this passage, one of the points is, they decided, no, you don't have to become culturally Jewish. You don't have to observe all of these things in order to become a Christian. And so the modern day counterpart, one of the applications is, do you have to become American to become a Christian? No. Do you have to love classical music to become a Christian? No. Do you have to love modern music to become a Christian? No. Becoming a Christian is totally separate than nationality, than stylistic preferences. It's all separate. Okay, third and final is 1 Corinthians 14, where Paul talks about intelligibility. He says, in the church, I would rather speak 5 intelligible words to instruct others than 10,000 words in a tongue. This whole chapter is about tongues, and that's another video for another day, but the point Paul is getting at is he really loves people to come to worship and be able to understand what's going on. Both believers who are in worship should understand what's going on, and even non-Christians who come in should understand what's going on. So when we have the style discussion, that's kind of what we're talking about. We want to choose a style that is incarnate like Jesus was, that doesn't force people to change cultures, and like this, is intelligible. Those are just 3 quick things. How do we enculturate? How do we incarnate? those are some of the guiding things that we do here at Sunlight.
I think it's so important. And I previously, before I came to Sunlight and was a pastor here, my wife and I were missionaries in Nigeria. And I love some of the things that we're talking about here. The translatability of the gospel from one culture to the next. I just love that Christ makes himself real to people from their own cultural frame, that people don't have to convert to another culture to become Christian. And that's not true of every religion. I mean, if you're going to become Muslim, pretty much you've got to become like a Middle Eastern person.
That's right.
You've even got to take on the language. You can't even understand the Quran apart from Arabic. But here, Christianity, the Bible was actually written in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. It's inherently translatable. It's inherently incarnational. It takes on the form and the style of any new culture it encounters, and becomes very intelligible from that cultural framework. And I think, man, I love those things. I think it's so important. I revere Christ for what he's done, that he loves us so much. He wants to become real to me and to every person.
Yeah, I think it's not a question of whether we enculturate, but how we enculturate, right? I mean, if you think about it, if you don't enculturate at all, then we're reading the Bible in Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic to you.
Right.
And we're worshiping with instruments that pretty much don't exist anymore. I mean...
with a harp and lyre.
Yes. So there's always some degree of taking this timeless truth of the Bible and bringing it into a culture. It's easy to see on the mission field. When you were on the mission field in Nigeria, the enculturation, the adaptation of that to your context was easy to see as an important goal, but oftentimes in America we overlook the importance of properly.
I wouldn't necessarily even say that. I think actually missionaries face a lot of big questions when it comes to how far to go, because you have some issues about going too far or not going far enough.
Yeah, why don't you talk about that? That's our next slide here. 2 extremes to avoid.
Well, one thing is that you just make Christianity so much like the culture that you wind up with some kind of syncretism.
Right.
Where really, Christianity makes no difference. It's just the culture that you encountered with no Christianity added on.
Yeah, and you might have brought in some conflicting beliefs from culture, like witchcraft or these weird occult practices, ancestor worship. Some things are just not compatible with Christianity.
And we're supposed to be different. The first thing that happens when you become a Christian is, you're in the world, but you're not of the world. You're pulled out of your culture to some certain extent. And that's important. We can't just go all the way and become syncretistic so that there's no difference between us and the world around us. I think every Christian knows we cannot be like the world around us.
Yeah.
But, there's another extreme, which is that you don't enculturate at all. And you just think, as a missionary, hey, my culture is the one that you have to become. And we do everything right, and so you just have to, do it our way. In the United States, maybe that would be like European culture. This is the only right way, or however that looks. And that's another extreme that has to be avoided. And so there's a lot of careful thought that has to go into this whole process of enculturation. What's appropriate and what's not. And, it's like two poles, and they have to be held in tension. We have to enculturate. We can't just maintain some exterior culture to us, but we can't go too far and just become syncretistic and like the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think, again, the tension is seen in the writings of Paul. We already saw him talk about needing to reach the culture intelligibly. He also said he would become all things to all people to try to win some. That's on the one hand, but on the other hand, he condemned people for looking like the culture in some ways. So it's maybe, again, not a question of whether we enculturate, but how. What aspects of culture do we pull from, and what aspects of culture do we reject? It's a really interesting balancing act that we all have to face. Anyway, so let's talk lastly about how we do this at this church. So if we're trying to enculturate for South Florida, how do we not be syncretistic, but how do we also not be culturally imperialistic, that we're coming in and telling these Southern Floridans, listen, this is the way to do it. Your music
Right.
is not godly enough. Your way of dress is not right.
Well, let's not start with music.
Yes.
Let's just start with language, and
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
start with this issue of the translatability of the Bible and the translatability of the gospel. And let's just start with something as simple as this, which is we choose to use a modern Bible translation as opposed to, for instance, the King James Version of the Bible, which comes from the 1600s. People today don't speak with thee and thou and thine and, the older archaic language form. That's not for us. It's interesting that the style of Greek into which the Bible was written was called Koine Greek, which was the common Greek, the everyday language of people. And so one of the things we do, like we use the NIV here, which is a great modern translation, we want the Bible and the concepts of the Bible to be expressed in language that's eminently understandable today rather than remote and archaic.
Yeah.
So before we even get to music, we want to use language that is intelligible.
Yeah, I think it's really important what you just said, and you're really passionate about it. We talk about it in our staff meetings a lot, how in everything we do in our worship service, we want to come across as plain spoken, easy to understand. We don't want people to have to come in and learn a new language, new lingo, feel like outsiders. Just like the New Testament itself, we want to be the street language, the language of the people. I think that's what we do. That also applies to music. I don't know if you ever thought about this, Scott, but there's a music of the people too, just as much as there's a language of the people. One of the authors I was recently reading said this: most congregations today have departed from King James English, and for good reason. That form of English is a barrier to communication if it's not the predominant language of the congregation. As with language, not all music is equally understandable to all people. And so he's just acknowledging that there's a heart language and there's a heart musical language. So it's unlike we've chosen a musical style that just like the language we use is designed to speak to the people that we're trying to reach.
Yeah, I mean, I have actually spent a lot of time. I actually approach ministry here a lot like I approach missionary service. One of the things you've got to do is, as you become a missionary, you've got to see what is the musical style that's appropriate in this culture and in this context. Now, where I was in Nigeria, that had a lot to do with beating drums, and the style of music was quite different than what we have here. Even instrumentation and voices. But here in this culture, what is the music style that's the most common to the ordinary common person? And it's like a pop style of music that has a band and a singer. And so actually the kind of musical choices we've made here as far as style fits with the type of music that you might listen to if you were to just, the ordinary person, turn on the radio on their drive to work.
And I would argue, as someone who exists within that style, as their native musical language, it's a beautiful style.
Yeah.
It's just as classical music has beauty, pop music has beauty too. I think of the electric guitar, I don't know if I've ever told you this before, but I think of the electric guitar actually very similar to a pipe organ. You know, it's got a very gentle, soft way of being played, very ambient, very melodic and beautiful. And then it's also got some drive and some power and some passion. You know, a lot of the instruments we use like that are the same way. The drums can express a variety of things that we want to express to God. So yeah, and with lighting too. It's the modern form of stained glass, in my opinion. We're just continuing what the church has always done, which is find a culturally appropriate way to speak to the grandeur of God, the intimacy of God, God's call for beauty. I love it.
Right, I think that's helpful. And of course, if you go to another place or another time or another culture, it's going to look different.
Yeah.
And I think what we're saying is that should be celebrated.
Yeah.
That is a wonderful aspect of Christianity.
Yeah.
That I think is fantastic.
It's a unique part of Christianity that, like you said, is to be celebrated. And to do that, we have to have a little bit of charity. We have to have an outsider focus. So that's maybe our final word, or my final word is, we realize that you can turn on any Pandora station, any Spotify station. You have at your disposal Monday through Saturday any subgenre of music you could possibly want and meet your preference. But when you go to church, you're linking up with 400 or 500 other people, and sometimes it just takes a little bit of Christian maturity and hope and heart and love, to be with the person beside you and to worship sometimes for their sake. Or even more than that, to join your heart with a mission to reach the community.
Right.
With a style of worship that's missionary in nature, just like you were a missionary.
Now, this tends to be one of those areas which raises a lot of passions.
Yeah.
People feel passionate about one style or the other, about whether that's style of dress or style of music. But I think what you're saying is very good. Instead of being so concerned with what I like, you come with a charitable mindset of what's best for the overall mission and what is best for the people who are gathering around me. I think that's really helpful. I am guessing, because it's one of these things that raise a lot of passions, there's any number of things that people who are watching might contribute to the conversation. We'd love that. We'd love you to comment. We would love you to ask questions. We're going to be talking about worship now for a number of weeks, and if there's some specific things you have questions about, we'd love to hear from you.
All right, well, that wraps up our show for today. Thanks so much for watching, and we hope to see you at the Fall Festival this Saturday at 4 o'clock.